Hey guys, tonight we begin with something deeply fascinating: the state of mental health in medieval times. What did it mean to feel anxious, depressed, or simply off? Well, let's just say therapy wasn't covered by the local guild. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the basics. In medieval Europe, your mental health, your moods, your energy, your thoughts, your tendency to cry over burnt porridge was believed to be controlled by a stew of internal fluids. These weren't metaphorical. They were literal bodily juices. And yes, someone somewhere probably tried to measure them. This ancient system came courtesy of the Greeks, specifically Hippocrates and Galen, and it stuck around for centuries longer than it had any right to. The theory of the four humours claimed your health, personality and mood were all controlled by the balance of blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Each fluid was tied to a personality type. Too much blood? You were cheerful and energetic until you got annoying and they bled you with leeches. Excess yellow bile made you angry and impulsive, great for battle, bad for dinner parties. Black bile was associated with melancholy, what we'd now call depression, but back then was a mood imbalance caused by cold and dry conditions, and too much sitting around thinking. And phlegm? That was for the slow, the calm, the maybe he's just tired. So if you were sad, you didn't need therapy. You needed a bucket and a guy with a knife. The preferred cure for emotional distress was bloodletting, a fun little procedure where someone opened a vein and hoped it made you feel better before you passed out. If that didn't work, you might be prescribed laxatives, because obviously, when your soul hurts, it's your bowels. Physicians, and we're using that word generously here, would diagnose you by asking probing questions like, "Do you feel moist or dry today?" They might examine your urine, consult the stars, or smell your breath. The conclusion: always the humours. You were either too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry, or simply too difficult to treat without divine intervention. It's worth remembering that these weren't fringe beliefs. This was mainstream medicine for centuries. So when you imagine a medieval person having a panic attack, don't picture a concerned friend offering tea. Picture a man with a robe, a chart of fluids, and a very sharp knife saying, "Let's drain the sad out." In medieval Europe, if you felt off, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and couldn't blame it on sin, demons, or your neighbour's weird bread, there was another obvious culprit: the moon. Yes, that bright glowing orb in the sky was believed to have direct influence over your mental state. The term lunatic didn't come out of nowhere. It comes from luna, the Latin word for moon. And people genuinely believed that too much exposure to moonlight could scramble your brain like an undercooked egg. This wasn't just folk belief either. It was widely accepted by doctors, clergy, philosophers, and that guy yelling near the well. The idea was that the moon, being a celestial body with feelings, could mess with your bodily fluids, especially your brain fluids, which were assumed to slosh around your skull like sad soup whenever the full moon hit just right. People who acted strangely around the time of a full moon weren't considered stressed, overwhelmed, or neurodivergent. They were just moonstruck. Some were even locked away temporarily until the lunar cycle passed, which was medieval healthcare's version of wait it out. The moon also got the blame for epilepsy, insomnia, hallucinations, and basically anything you couldn't easily treat with soup, leeches, or prayer. If you were up at night pacing or crying, they wouldn't ask about your childhood. They'd ask about the sky. Even animals weren't safe. Farmers swore that sheep acted skittish and dogs howled differently under a full moon. And if your ox kicked over a cart or your pig ran off into the woods, someone was bound to mutter, "The moon's up to something." Of course, there was no science to back any of this up, but in fairness, there also wasn't science. Most medical texts referenced astrology as casually as we reference caffeine, and treatments often included not just herbs and diet changes, but planetary alignments. Because sometimes it wasn't madness, it was just bad moon energy. If your mental health took a turn, say you started weeping into your bread, shouting at trees, or speaking in rhyming couplets, the first person to consult wasn't a doctor, it was the local priest. Why? Because in the Middle Ages the mind was considered a spiritual battlefield, and any behaviour outside the norm was immediately interpreted through a theological lens. Depression? Maybe you'd committed a sin and forgotten. Anxiety? A sure sign the devil was getting cozy in your soul. Hearing voices? Classic demonic Airbnb situation. Priests were essentially the default mental health professionals, except instead of therapy, they offered confession, fasting, and a stern reminder that you were made of dust and should probably act like it. If you showed signs of what we now call a mental illness, the priest would perform a moral diagnosis. Were you skipping church? Coveting thy neighbour's wife? Laughing too much? Yes, that was suspicious. If so, your condition might not require herbs. It might require repentance. For more extreme cases, like hallucinations, mutism, or erratic behaviour, the church had more robust tools. These included prayer vigils, pilgrimages, and, in special cases, minor exorcisms. Just to make sure your sadness wasn't a demon in disguise. Can't be too careful. Even routine emotions were under suspicion. Excessive joy could be seen as vanity. Deep sadness, sloth of the soul, also known as acedia, which was basically spiritual depression, treated with psalms and guilt. If you were melancholic, you weren't in need of support. You were morally slippery and possibly just not trying hard enough. The irony? Many people genuinely found comfort in the church's explanations. In a world without neuroscience, the idea that suffering had cosmic meaning was oddly reassuring. It gave structure to chaos, even if the treatment was a bit chant-heavy. Still, if you had a mental health issue in the Middle Ages, your best hope wasn't compassion. It was a priest with a decent bedside manner and a low threshold for demon accusations. So you've been hearing voices, having visions, or just talking to your soup too fondly. In today's world, you might get therapy, or at least a wellness podcast recommendation. In the Middle Ages, you got an exorcism. Yes, the preferred treatment for many mental disturbances was not medication or rest, but a firm and theatrical spiritual eviction. The logic was simple. If you were acting weird, it probably wasn't stress or trauma. It was Beelzebub making himself at home behind your eyeballs. And he wasn't paying rent. Exorcisms came in two varieties. The minor kind, which was basically an intense prayer circle with holy water and muttering, and the major kind, which was more of a live performance with a cast of one very nervous patient, one heavily robed priest, and a backup choir of concerned monks humming in Latin. The rituals varied, but the essentials remained consistent. Chanting, reading scripture, signs of the cross, relics, and occasionally yelling things like, "Depart, foul spirit," directly into your face. If you happened to flinch, that was seen as evidence it was working. If you didn't flinch, they just chanted louder. Some records describe afflicted people being tied down, sprinkled with salt, or forced to drink holy water. Others were made to fast for days beforehand, which, to be fair, could drive anyone to strange behaviour. One unfortunate soul reportedly had demons smoked out of his ears using burning sage, frankincense, and what we assume was a deep misunderstanding of ventilation. And if none of that worked, you were either deemed beyond help or tragically misdiagnosed as simply being naturally wicked. Not all exorcisms were terrifying, though. In many villages, they were communal events where people gathered in the town square to witness a good, old-fashioned supernatural showdown. Think of it as medieval spiritual theatre. Part religious ritual, part entertainment, part neighbourhood gossip starter. But in truth, most people who underwent exorcisms weren't evil. They were just overwhelmed, traumatized, neurodivergent, or unlucky enough to have a panic attack near a bishop. Let's say you weren't quite disturbed enough for an exorcism, but still deeply troubling at dinner. You wept for no reason, forgot your own name on occasion, or spent a bit too long staring at firewood philosophically. In this case, your treatment wouldn't involve ropes or shouting, just a lot of praying. Possibly while being locked in a room. This was known in some circles as the gentle approach to mental health. You'd be told that your condition was spiritual in origin and could be overcome through self-reflection, discipline, and, of course, relentless repentance. Essentially, medieval mental health care boiled down to, have you tried feeling bad about it? The logic was that suffering purified the soul, so if you were already suffering mentally, clearly you were halfway there. Monks and nuns, some genuinely compassionate, others just chronically overworked, might guide you through periods of meditative silence, prayer vigils, fasting, and sleeping on uncomfortable surfaces until either the devil left or you forgot what happiness felt like. Some people voluntarily entered monasteries as a kind of medieval retreat center. These weren't quite spas, more like spiritual timeout chambers. You got a cell, a Bible, and 8 hours of daily chanting. Occasionally, you'd also get stew. Whether this helped mental illness or simply masked it with religious exhaustion is still debated. And then there were the relics. Feeling unwell? Touch the bone fragment of a saint? Trouble sleeping? Sleep near a vial of martyr's blood? Sad for no reason? That's what the toe of St. Euphemia is for. The idea was that holiness was contagious, like kindness, or fleas. Now, to be fair, this was the closest thing to compassionate care in many places. Unlike exorcisms or beatings, the prayer-based route didn't usually involve injury. Just lots of chanting and being told your thoughts were problematic. Sometimes monks genuinely helped people through community, quietude, and structured routine. Other times, they just told you to fast and hope for divine clarity by sunrise. Let's say your condition went beyond moody sighs and occasional candle staring. Maybe you'd started wandering barefoot through town mumbling about angels, or loudly debating theology with barn animals. At that point, the medieval response wasn't a support group. It was a stone room with one window and no doorknob on your side. Enter the monastic cell, or as some historians delicately put it, protective isolation. These cells were tucked inside monasteries or churches and were considered a form of mercy, emphasis on considered. You wouldn't be chained or tortured, hopefully, but you would be firmly encouraged not to leave, sometimes for years. The space was simple, bare walls, maybe a straw mat, and if you were lucky, a little window through which food, mostly cold gruel, would arrive twice a day. Human contact was rare, because the working theory was that your madness was contagious, emotionally, spiritually, or atmospherically. You weren't entirely forgotten, though. Monks might offer prayers for your soul. Occasionally, a kindly brother might bring herbs or read psalms outside your door in a tone that suggested you weren't the worst thing they'd seen that week. Sometimes, the locked room was not part of a monastery, but an actual public institution, the early versions of asylums. These weren't common until much later, but a few existed in medieval Islamic cities, and by the 13th century, in places like London and Paris. The goal? Shelter, not treatment, and certainly not recovery. Now, to their credit, the medieval mindset wasn't always cruel. Many believed the mentally unwell were closer to the divine, touched by God, or perhaps walking that fine line between prophecy and peculiar behavior. But practically speaking, locking someone away for their own good was just easier than figuring out what to do with them. Families often begged monasteries to take in afflicted relatives, promising donations in return. The alternative was trying to explain to the neighbours why Uncle Thaddeus was shouting Latin in the cabbage patch again. If you were a woman in medieval Europe and found yourself overwhelmed, irritable, or tearful, perhaps after your 11th child or your 3rd husband with plague breath, congratulations, you were probably diagnosed with hysteria, Now, diagnosed is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. Hysteria wasn't so much a diagnosis, as it was a blanket explanation for, this woman is behaving in a way that makes men uncomfortable. Crying too much? Hysteria. Not crying enough? Suspicious, possibly a witch. Expressing opinions, ambition, or fatigue? Definitely a uterus problem. The term itself comes from the Greek hystera, meaning womb. The theory, and brace yourself, was that a woman's uterus could become unmoored and wander freely about the body, causing trouble wherever it went. Yes, that's right. A rogue, floating womb was blamed for everything from anxiety to chronic sighing. Somewhere in your abdomen, your uterus was just doing laps and ruining your day. Symptoms of hysteria included shortness of breath, nervousness, fainting, emotional outbursts, and, to quote one actual medieval source, too much thought. Truly a devastating condition. Treatments varied. A priest might recommend fasting and prayer. A physician might apply herbs. And in some cases, rather awkward manual stimulation was prescribed to calm the uterus, performed by midwives or, in later centuries, by early gynecologists with a concerning lack of supervision. Marriage was also considered a cure. If a woman was single, she needed a husband to settle her womb. If she was married, then obviously she just needed to be pregnant again. Either way, her mental health was treated with more chores and less rest. And if she kept acting strangely, seeing visions, resisting housework, or having too many thoughts in Latin, things could escalate. Some women were accused of witchcraft because nothing screams mental illness, like growing herbs and asking questions. But not all was bleak. In some cases, women found support from convents where the demands of daily life were lighter and emotional distress was seen as part of spiritual struggle. Some nuns even wrote about their anguish in ways that sound suspiciously modern, minus the demon metaphors. Still, if you were a woman in the Middle Ages with feelings, your best mental health strategy was simple. Keep it quiet, keep it short, and never, ever talk to your cat in public. In a time when monks prescribed fasting, priests blamed demons, and physicians swore by bleeding your soul out through your ankle, the real MVPs of medieval mental health were the herbalists, often elderly women with gardens, cats, and suspiciously good intuition. These wise women, sometimes called cunning folk, were the unofficial, unlicensed therapists of their day. They didn't ask how your humours were feeling. They asked when it started, how you were sleeping, and whether your mother-in-law was bothering you again. Their methods were simple: tea, tinctures, and talking, though the talking part was often disguised as advice about herbs. You'd sit in a smoky cottage surrounded by drying plants, and before long you'd be sipping something made of valerian root and lavender while ranting about your neighbour's pig. It was like therapy, but it also cured warts. Herbalists treated sadness with calming infusions. Anxiety was soothed with chamomile and balm. If you were really distraught, you might get mugwort, St. John's wort, or, in desperate cases, a stiff dose of poppy extract. They called it a sleep aid. You'd call it accidental time travel. Most of these women weren't formally educated, but their remedies were rooted in generational knowledge, observation, and something modern medicine likes to call actually listening to the patient, which, unfortunately, also made them suspicious to everyone else. The church viewed them as threats. After all, they operated outside the religious system, didn't quote scripture, and didn't insist every problem came from sin. Some towns quietly appreciated them. Others accused them of witchcraft if they got too popular, too effective, or too confident in public. Still, they were often the only source of comfort for people suffering from what we'd now call depression, trauma, or plain old burnout. If you were lucky, your village herbalist knew how to blend calming herbs, light a protective candle, and tell you that no, you weren't cursed. You were just tired and underappreciated. Were their treatments perfect? Of course not. Sometimes they rubbed onions on your feet. But compared to being locked in a stone room or yelled at by a monk holding a goat skull, the herbalist's approach was practically holistic luxury. So far, we've covered prayers, isolation, and a charming herbalist with an herbalist's license issued by no one. But medieval mental health had one more tier of solutions, the truly imaginative ones, the kind that made you wonder if the physician was just winging it based on dreams and pantry contents. Let's begin with the dead owl treatment. Yes, if you were plagued by sadness or excessive thoughts, one popular remedy was to tie a dead owl to your head. It was believed the owl, a symbol of wisdom, would absorb the confusion or melancholy through your scalp. In practice, it mostly absorbed flies. Feeling particularly anxious? Try powdered emeralds. That's right, jewel dust. Physicians recommended grinding actual gemstones and rubbing the sparkly remains on your chest or consuming tiny amounts. Not only did it not work, it was a great way to ruin both your digestive tract and your jewelry collection. Then there were the cures involving astrology, which were less medical and more vibe check from the stars. A patient's mental disturbance might be blamed on Mars being in a bad mood. Treatment? Wait until Jupiter looked friendlier. One medieval medical manual suggested wrapping the sufferer in wolfskin during a thunderstorm to scare off the madness. Another recommended whispering into the left ear of a black dog and then letting it run away with your sorrow, like a very sad, very hairy therapy courier. You could also find remedies involving smoked herbs stuffed into pigeons, which were then waved near your head. No one's quite sure what this was supposed to do, but it was very aromatic and quite annoying to the pigeon. And if none of that worked, there was always pilgrimage, the all-purpose medieval solution to everything. Pack your sandals, grab a staff, and walk hundreds of miles to a holy site. With any luck, you'd either find spiritual peace, or at least get enough blisters to distract from your emotional state. These oddball cures remind us that medieval medicine wasn't entirely malicious, just wildly misinformed, often experimental, and occasionally bird-based. And hey, if nothing else, they gave people hope, which in those days was about as close to Prozac as it got. Every medieval town, big or small, seemed to have that guy. You know the one. Dressed oddly, muttering to himself, sometimes blessing chickens, sometimes cursing puddles, the town madman. And strangely enough, society didn't always lock him away or call for holy water. They just let him be. In an age when mental health was misunderstood at best and feared at worst, this was oddly progressive. People with visible mental illness weren't always banished. They were often absorbed into daily life, tolerated like unpredictable weather, or that one goat who thinks he owns the street. The madman, or madwoman, though women were sadly more likely to be accused of witchcraft, held a peculiar place in the medieval social order. Not quite a threat, not quite a joke, and occasionally revered. In some towns, these individuals were even seen as touched by God, or given a grudging respect for their unpredictability. If they spouted cryptic phrases while staring into the sun, people assumed it was divine prophecy, or just Wednesday. They were usually given a nickname: Old Will the Wanderer, Mad Meg, Tom Fool. You'll notice these sound suspiciously like pub names, which says a lot about how much people drank while pondering madness. These individuals often lived on the fringes, sleeping in abandoned mills, church porches, or literal barrels, Diogenes style. Townsfolk would sometimes give them food, or shoes, or just a wide berth. Children were told not to stare, which of course meant they stared constantly. Occasionally their strange behaviour would lead to small acts of charity. A baker might leave out crusts. A blacksmith might repair a bent walking stick. Medieval communities, for all their superstition, could be surprisingly compassionate, especially when guilt and the fear of eternal damnation were good motivators. But if the madman's behaviour got too loud, too violent, or too unsettling, patience ran out. Then came the priests, the isolation, or worse. Tolerance had limits, especially if the afflicted stopped being amusing and started being inconvenient. In modern times, we understand that depression is a complex condition involving brain chemistry, life circumstances, and sometimes just terrible Mondays. But in the Middle Ages, if you were feeling persistently low, tired, or like life was a slow-motion mudslide, congratulations, you were guilty of acedia. Acedia wasn't seen as a mental health issue. It was classified as a spiritual failure, one of the original deadly sins before sloth eventually stole its thunder and got top billing. Acedia was sadness at divine good, or in more practical terms, spiritual apathy, lack of joy, and the general medieval version of lying in bed staring at the ceiling. Monks were especially prone to this condition, which they poetically called the noonday demon. Picture it, a monk supposed to be copying psalms, staring at a wall, wondering what the point of it all is. In today's world, that's called burnout. In the 12th century, it was a moral crisis requiring urgent rebuke and possibly more prayer beads. Sufferers of acedia weren't offered comfort. They were told to pray harder, work more, and stop being selfish. Depression wasn't a condition. It was laziness with branding. If your soul didn't feel joy, it was your fault. Maybe you hadn't repented hard enough. Maybe you were secretly proud. Maybe, and this was the nuclear option, you were letting Satan win. And if you dared to express your sorrow out loud, you weren't just pitied, you were viewed as contagious. Sadness could spread. It was like emotional mildew, and monasteries didn't want it soaking into the walls. Lay people weren't immune either. If you couldn't find joy in your toil, it wasn't because you were exhausted or grieving. It was a sign that you needed to go to confession, and maybe build a shed out of guilt. Ironically, some writings from monks who battled acedia sound remarkably modern. Descriptions of numbness, fatigue, restlessness, even suicidal thoughts. But instead of therapy, they prescribed fasting and mentally cataloguing your sins in alphabetical order. In a time when most people owned 2 shirts and one of them was infested with fleas, you'd think laughter would be encouraged. A little joy, perhaps? A chuckle to get through the plague-filled, mud-splattered, leech-happy nightmare that was daily life. Think again. In medieval Europe, laughter wasn't always a sign of happiness. It was often considered a moral red flag. Sure, peasants laughed. Jesters laughed. Occasionally, even monks cracked a smile if a goose did something particularly scandalous. But the official stance from theologians, chroniclers, and very serious people was that laughter could be dangerous, a gateway emotion to chaos, sin, and possibly dancing. The Church, ever watchful of human weakness, warned against excessive mirth. Thomas Aquinas, whose sense of humour was reportedly filed under to be developed, believed that laughter should be moderate and serve a higher purpose. Uncontrolled laughter? A sign of spiritual disorder, maybe even demonic influence. After all, who laughs without reason? Answer: people with a functioning sense of humour. Women, of course, were doubly judged. A laughing woman was clearly up to something, witchcraft probably, while a solemn, silent woman was appropriately pious, or just very dehydrated. And let's not forget the laughter of the mad. If someone laughed at inappropriate times, say during a funeral or while milking a goat, it wasn't seen as eccentric. It was seen as evidence of mental illness, possession, or both. Involuntary giggling was basically a red flag with a tambourine. In some religious orders, novices were explicitly forbidden to laugh during meals, prayer, or basically any activity that might spark human connection. Joy was fine in theory, but it had to be the wholly inward kind, not the belly-aching, wine-snorting kind you get after someone slips on a turnip. Still, people did laugh. Humour survived in village festivals, in satirical poetry, and in that one guy in every town who made funny noises with his armpits. But it was always a little risky. Joy was tolerated, but not trusted. In today's world, talking to your cat is quirky. In the Middle Ages, it was potentially heretical, mildly alarming, and, depending on the tone of your voice, grounds for questioning your sanity or scheduling a light exorcism. You see, medieval society had very clear ideas about who you could and could not have conversations with. People were fine, priests better. But if you started chatting with animals, invisible angels, or anything that didn't answer back, out loud, eyebrows were raised, usually followed by torches. Let's start with animals. Cats were already walking a fine line. On one hand, they controlled pests. On the other, they were sleek, mysterious, and never went to church. If you confided in your tabby too often, people might assume she was your familiar, sent by the devil to whisper forbidden wisdom about herbal remedies and where your neighbour hid his cheese. Birds were also suspect. Medieval bestiaries were full of half-true and fully weird facts. If someone said a crow told them the future, that wasn't poetic. That was treason against sanity. Even dogs, mankind's loyal companions, were acceptable, until they started appearing in your dreams wearing robes and quoting scripture. Then there were the angels, who, according to countless religious texts, were everywhere, watching, protecting, and occasionally delivering ominous messages during thunderstorms. If you claimed to see or hear them often, you might be considered saintly, or if your timing was poor, mad, or possessed. The difference often depended on whether you were in a monastery or yelling at clouds in the town square. And of course, imaginary friends. Children got a pass. Mostly. But adults? If you claimed to be speaking with invisible beings who gave you instructions, the options were limited. Prophet, lunatic, or future bonfire decoration. There wasn't much middle ground. Interestingly, some mystics, like Hildegard of Bingen, claimed vivid visions and conversations with divine figures, and because they were cloistered, educated, and slightly intimidating, they were tolerated. But if you were a peasant named Bertram who talked to squirrels about theology, you probably weren't writing illuminated manuscripts anytime soon. In the medieval world, mental illness teetered between two extremes. Either you were a walking curiosity or a shameful family secret, and often both, depending on whether the village market was open. Let's start with public spectacle. If someone with visible mental illness wandered through town, muttering, dancing in the rain, or arguing passionately with a bucket, they might attract attention, not scorn. In fact, they could become a fixture of village life, like the bell tower or that one goat that always escaped. People would watch, whisper, maybe even laugh, not out of cruelty, well, not always, but out of a weird blend of amusement and fear. Because deep down, everyone worried. That could be me next week if I get hit on the head or eat spoiled eel pie. In some places, these individuals were known as natural fools, a term that sounds insulting, but was weirdly affectionate by medieval standards. They were seen as innocent, almost childlike, and sometimes believed to have been touched by God, fate, or just a very unfortunate moon phase. You could end up with food, shelter, and a nickname. It wasn't ideal, but in a world without therapy, it beat being locked in a tower. But for families, not so charming. If your relative was quietly struggling, maybe depressed, withdrawn, or plagued by what we'd now call anxiety, it was often handled as a private matter, which, in medieval terms, meant don't talk about it, ever. Shame was a powerful social currency, and a troubled mind in the household could reflect poorly on the whole lineage. Some families kept afflicted members hidden. Others sent them to monasteries or pilgrimage routes, hoping divine geography would work where herbal tea had failed. In some sadder cases, people were disowned entirely, especially if they were seen as disruptive or, worst of all, embarrassing at weddings. Public mental health care barely existed. Shame filled the gap where support systems should have been. No clinics, no community outreach. Just a mix of whispered prayers and pretending everything was fine. By the end of the Middle Ages, somewhere around the late 15th century, give or take a plague, things started to shift. Not quickly, not gracefully, but if you squinted hard enough, you could spot the early signs of humanity inching toward compassion, one confused scholar at a time. For one, philosophy and science began to sneak into the conversation. Thanks to Arabic medical texts preserved and translated in places like Spain and Sicily, Western Europe was reintroduced to ancient Greek thinkers, who, while not exactly modern psychologists, had at least considered that the human mind wasn't just a demonic puppet show. Scholars started to flirt with the idea that madness could stem from imbalances in the body, not just sins or sorcery. Physicians began to write treatises discussing melancholy and mania, with slightly fewer biblical quotes and slightly more anatomy. Don't get excited. Treatments still involved things like apply leech to temple, but at least people were reading. At the same time, the idea of charitable care began to evolve. In cities like Valencia and Cairo, early hospitals started to separate out patients with mental disturbances from general wards. Some even offered gardens, music, and conversation. It was still far from dignified, but better than being yelled at by a priest while tied to a goat post. The printing press didn't hurt either. With more access to books, ideas about the mind began to spread faster than syphilis at a midsummer fair. This helped plant the seeds for the Renaissance, when mental illness began its long, uphill climb from "you're cursed" to "you might need support." Of course, not everything changed. People still feared what they didn't understand, and the line between madness and mysticism remained as thin as a monk's bedsheet. But the groundwork was laid. Slowly, the mad were no longer seen solely as vessels of sin or divine wrath. They were, in a radical twist, beginning to be seen as human, fallible, suffering, and worthy of care. Not hugs, though. That would come centuries later. From the outside, noble life looked divine. Perfumed corridors, diamond-crusted attire, servants waiting on every whim. Whether at Versailles or within the imperial walls of Kyoto, nobility projected an illusion of perfection, elegance frozen in time like a portrait. But what the public didn't see was the suffocating reality beneath the powdered faces and rigid etiquette. For many nobles, this life of luxury was less like heaven and more like a velvet-lined prison. Every aspect of a noble's day, from when to rise to how to fold a napkin, was dictated by unwritten rules or ceremonial codes. In France, nobles were expected to perform the lever ritual each morning, where courtiers would literally line up to watch the king get out of bed. Participation wasn't optional. If you weren't seen in the right rooms at the right hours, rumours spread. Your influence shrank. Your enemies smiled. And at Versailles, losing social capital was often deadlier than losing money. Across the world in Japan, court nobles in Kyoto faced a different but equally suffocating script. The high-end elite were expected to master poetry, calligraphy, music, and the subtle art of aloof expression. Every word, every bow, every sleeve movement was political theatre. And failure to perform correctly? Social suicide. Even leisure was performative. A ball wasn't just a party. It was a test of alliances. A walk in the garden might be a silent battlefield of glances and veiled insults. You weren't simply living your life. You were playing a role in an eternal play, where the audience was everyone, and the stakes were your legacy. And yet, few nobles escaped, because the very privileges that made them admired also kept them chained. Inheritance laws, arranged marriages, debt obligations, and the constant surveillance of rivals meant they rarely had control over their own fates. Behind the closed doors of their manor houses, many nobles experienced mental decline, quiet rebellion, or spiritual despair. But in public, they smiled, always smiled. This was the great paradox of noble life. The more prestige you had, the less freedom you possessed. They were born at the top, but often died without ever living for themselves. When you picture a nobleman striding through Versailles in silk stockings, or a lady gliding down a staircase in pearls, the last thing you imagine is debt collectors. But behind all the glamour, a surprising number of nobles were financially drowning. It turns out that maintaining the illusion of wealth was more expensive than actual wealth itself. At Versailles, appearances were everything. A noble might spend more on a new waistcoat or ball gown than on maintaining an entire estate. Why? Because fashion was currency. If you didn't keep up, you vanished. politically, socially, and eventually financially. Courtiers would gamble enormous sums, not just at cards, but on horses, land speculation, and high-stakes alliances. Many nobles mortgaged ancestral estates to fund one more season of social relevance. And the king didn't help. Louis XIV, in particular, kept nobles close, not just physically, but economically. He encouraged extravagant spending at court to keep them dependent, distracted, and loyal. A ruined noble was a controllable noble. In England, the aristocracy wasn't much better off. During the Georgian era, lords and ladies often lived in opulent townhouses in London, financed entirely on credit. Tailors, wine merchants, and milliners were expected to wait months, sometimes years, for payment. Entire families balanced on the edge of collapse, hoping their daughter would marry a wealthier man, or that some distant cousin would die and leave them a title and a working estate. Meanwhile, in Russia, nobles were granted vast lands populated by serfs, and yet many were still cash poor. The wealth was illiquid. Lavish lifestyles in Moscow required constant borrowing. Pawn shops discreetly handled tiaras and sabres. Family jewels were sold under candlelight behind locked doors. Japan's noble class fared no better during periods of peace. As the samurai class shifted from warrior to bureaucrat during the Tokugawa era, many nobles found themselves ceremonial but irrelevant. Stipends shrank, costs remained. Some took side jobs. Yes, actual jobs, in poetry schools or estate management, to keep up appearances. But admitting financial hardship was a dishonor, so debts piled in secret. The lesson? Nobility wasn't about financial stability, it was about the performance of wealth. And often, that performance came at a soul-crushing cost. Scandal was the unofficial second language of the nobility. Affairs, duels, secret children, whispered betrayals. The more polished the public image, the dirtier the private truths. Nobles had power, prestige, and privilege. But what many of them didn't have? Restraint. In Versailles, courtiers lived in such close quarters that privacy was nearly non-existent, and yet illicit liaisons flourished. Queen Marie Antoinette was endlessly accused of romantic entanglements, whether with Swedish nobles or her inner circle of ladies. Many of these rumours were false, but they stuck because everyone knew someone who was doing exactly that. The court practically ran on gossip, and scandal wasn't just tolerated, it was currency. Your name in someone else's bedroom could either elevate your influence or ruin your bloodline. Meanwhile, over in England, aristocratic reputations were shredded in salons and gambling houses. Lord Byron, for example, was rumoured to have fathered children with his half-sister. That didn't stop him from being a celebrity, but it cast a long shadow over his noble status. Nobles were expected to have mistresses, just not too many, and definitely not the wrong ones. Affairs with actresses, commoners, or foreign spies. That could lead to exile, imprisonment, or in rare cases, an early grave. In Imperial Russia, the court of Catherine the Great was notorious for its openness. The Empress herself had lovers throughout her reign, often hand-picked and elevated to positions of power. But it wasn't just Catherine. Her courtiers were constantly engaged in intrigues, often mixing political manoeuvring with bedroom games. Affairs were less about love and more about leverage. Even in the refined Heian court of Japan, where restraint and poetry reigned, scandal found its way through haiku and love letters. A noblewoman might receive a midnight visitor whose identity she would never reveal. But her next poem, shared among the elite, might offer just enough metaphor to ignite a wildfire of speculation. The most dangerous scandals, though, were the ones that never made it into letters or court whispers, the ones involving treason, espionage, and betrayal of blood. These were whispered in corridors, documented in coded correspondence, and buried in family archives. Because in noble life, scandal wasn't the exception, it was the wallpaper. Beautiful, intricate, and always hiding cracks underneath. For all their earthly power and luxury, nobles were often tormented by a far less visible force, the crushing weight of spiritual uncertainty. They had everything, yet still wrestled with existential dread. Being born into privilege didn't grant clarity about the afterlife, morality, or divine purpose. In fact, it often made things worse. In Catholic France, guilt clung to the corridors of palaces like smoke. The same nobles who attended Mass daily might also indulge in debauchery every night. Confession was routine, but more for social performance than true penitence. Still, many nobles, especially as they aged, were haunted by their sins. Some turned toward mystics and visionaries, desperate for answers. Even Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, grew more devout in his final years, racked with fear over his worldly indulgences and the wars he'd waged. Across Europe, nobles funded churches and monasteries not just out of piety, but insurance. In their minds, a new chapel might buy them a cleaner conscience. 1,000 candles lit in their name could offset a life of intrigue and excess. Some retreated into monastic life altogether in old age, swapping velvet robes for hair shirts. In Orthodox Russia, things were more intense. Nobles were expected to uphold both political and spiritual order, yet many wrestled with doubt, especially during the turbulent reigns of czars who declared themselves chosen by God, even as they ordered purges. Some nobles sought answers in secret prayer circles or turned to fools for Christ, holy wanderers who renounced wealth and comfort to speak uncomfortable truths. These odd mystics sometimes served as the only outlet for aristocrats facing spiritual crisis. Meanwhile, in feudal Japan, the samurai nobility hybrid class often found themselves torn between Confucian ethics, Shinto rituals, and Buddhist detachment. Some nobles turned to Zen, hoping meditation would silence their inner turmoil. Others composed poetry not just for art's sake, but as spiritual catharsis. Still, the tension between duty, honor, and the impermanence of life gnawed at them. When a noble committed seppuku, it wasn't always about shame. Sometimes it was about spiritual release. Despite their silks and titles, nobles were often profoundly lost. Surrounded by ritual and grandeur, many still stared into the void, wondering if any of it truly mattered. Behind the masks of status, their souls were whispering, and sometimes screaming, for peace. In the age before smartphones and email, the most dangerous thing a noble could send wasn't an assassin. It was a letter. Ink on parchment could undo a dynasty, expose an affair, or spark a revolution. And nobles, despite their outward elegance, were compulsive correspondents. They wrote everything down: secrets, longings, schemes, prayers, love, lies. These weren't idle pen-pal exchanges. They were calculated tools of diplomacy and survival. At Versailles, every noble had a paper trail: love letters to mistresses, pleas to creditors, carefully worded flatteries to the king. And not all of it was above board. Couriers carried sealed notes laced with invisible ink or written in cipher. A wrong phrase in the wrong hands could lead to exile or the scaffold. Some nobles even had personal ciphers, alphabets invented solely for clandestine conversations. The Duke of Orleans, for instance, was known to correspond with suspected radicals during the lead-up to the French Revolution, and his letters, meticulously coded. But ciphers were never foolproof. In one legendary case, a noble's encrypted diary was decoded long after his death, revealing a hidden life of treason and betrayal. In the Habsburg courts, marriage negotiations often played out through veiled language. A letter might begin with discussion of weather and falconry, but hide deeper intentions between the lines. Parents arranged matches through polite lies. Lovers begged for elopement under the guise of visiting countryside estates. In Japan's Heian era, poetry served as code. A single waka, just 31 syllables, could convey forbidden love, rejection, or a secret rendezvous. Noblewomen were particularly skilled at crafting double-meaning verses, often responding in kind within hours. These exchanges were delivered by discreet messengers, sometimes servants, sometimes children, always sworn to silence. During the Renaissance, some noblewomen ran entire espionage networks through their salons, writing to allies in foreign courts. In Russia, letters smuggled out of the Tsar's inner circle helped fuel uprisings. Nobles trapped in gilded cages turned to correspondence as their only form of rebellion. Paper became weapon, shield, and confession booth all in one. Of course, the riskiest letters were the ones that never arrived. Intercepted, burned, buried. Some lay hidden in attics and wall crevices for centuries, their secrets unread, their senders long forgotten. But make no mistake, within those ink-stained lines lived revolutions, heartbreak, and the rawest truths of the noble soul. In noble society, emotion was a luxury no one could afford. Joy, anger, fear, all were carefully measured, rationed, or concealed entirely. A noble's survival depended not just on wealth or title, but on mastering the art of emotional camouflage. To rule at court, one had to perform, and never, ever flinch. At Versailles, life was a never-ending theatre. Nobles rehearsed their smiles, their bows, their silences. A raised eyebrow could signal support or sabotage. Tears were reserved for funerals, and even then, only if the cameras of courtly judgment were watching. The goal was simple: project elegance, hide the chaos. Those who failed were branded unstable, hysterical, or worse, unfit. This emotional choreography was learned young. Noble children were taught to speak only when spoken to display pride without arrogance, and to suppress grief until it could be written about in private diaries. Meltdowns were not just embarrassing, they were politically dangerous. A single outburst could be remembered for decades and used as ammunition in future rivalries. In Japan's Heian court, nobles were even more refined in their restraint. Public emotion was seen as vulgar. One's true feelings were shared only through metaphor, in poetry, gestures, or carefully chosen silences. A noblewoman's sleeve might carry more meaning than her words. A fan opened halfway could signal heartbreak. A single cherry blossom plucked too early, despair. To survive, one had to master subtlety as fluently as language. In England, nobles kept a stiff upper lip. A scandal could be quietly swallowed with a brandy, but never spoken of. Behind closed doors, journals wept for them. Volumes of sorrow and suppressed rage bound in leather and sealed away in desk drawers. Mental illness, grief, shame, all of it was hidden behind ballroom smiles and military posture. Some cracked under the pressure. There are records of nobles who snapped mid-dance or collapsed during ceremonies, later confined to asylums or sent away to recuperate in remote estates. But these were whispered tragedies. The show, after all, had to go on, because in the grand masquerade of nobility, emotions were a liability. Masks weren't just for balls, they were daily attire. And behind every bow, every compliment, every elegant laugh, there was often a storm raging, perfectly concealed behind silk and etiquette. To be born noble was to inherit not just land and titles, but expectations so heavy they could crush the spirit. From the first breath, a noble child was less a person and more a vessel for legacy. Every decision they made was haunted by the demands of their ancestors and the judgment of generations yet unborn. In France, sons of dukes and counts were groomed like racehorses. Their futures were mapped out in ledgers and family trees. Marry this heiress. Befriend that prince. Don't embarrass the bloodline. Their lives were a continuation of a strategy that had started long before they were born, and often one they had no power to alter. Even the women were pawns on the family chessboard. A duchess's value was often measured by the strength of her dowry and the purity of her lineage. England's aristocracy had similar burdens. Firstborn sons inherited the estate, the debt, the staff, and the responsibility of ensuring the family didn't fall into disgrace, or worse, trade. Those who failed were remembered not for their humanity, but for being the one who lost the manor. Meanwhile, younger sons, without land or title, were quietly funneled into the church or military, with little choice in the matter. In Russia, noble families carried their status like a ticking time bomb. One misstep, one disagreement with the wrong court faction, and everything could be seized. Land, serfs, even the family name could be revoked. Generations of effort, wiped away with a signature. Japan's aristocracy was even more rigid. In Heian times, noble families competed for proximity to the emperor. Positions and influence were passed down not through merit, but through lineage. A single disgrace, a failed marriage, an unruly son, could undo centuries of prestige. The pressure to conform was immense, and individuality was often sacrificed on the altar of ancestral duty. And what of those who didn't want the title, who didn't want to marry the stranger, rule the estate, or bear the name? Rebellion wasn't just difficult, it was unthinkable. Some tried. Most were crushed by the machinery of tradition. The burden of inheritance wasn't just a financial or political matter, it was psychological, a crown of thorns worn under a golden halo. To be noble meant to be chained to a legacy, whether you wanted it or not. Not all nobles followed the script. Beneath layers of etiquette and centuries of family pressure, some cracked, and others resisted. But rebellion among the nobility wasn't always dramatic. There were no peasant uprisings here, no flaming torches, just quiet, subversive acts, tucked into corners of palaces, hidden behind locked doors, or disguised as tradition. In Versailles, where conformity reigned supreme, rebellion took on strange forms. Some nobles chose not to attend the king's elaborate mourning ritual, a grave offence that signalled independence. Others dared to wear colours out of fashion or commission portraits that didn't flatter. A few scandalised their families by marrying for love, not alliance. These small gestures in the world of court politics were explosive. In England, some aristocrats defied expectations by turning to art and literature. Lord Byron didn't just write poetry, he lived a life that mocked every expectation of noble restraint. Cross-dressing, travelling with lovers, scorning Parliament, his life was a rolling provocation. Less flamboyant nobles simply vanished to the countryside, retreating from London's social obligations. That alone could be interpreted as rebellion, a refusal to play the game. In Russia, quiet dissent took more dangerous forms. Some nobles supported revolutionary ideas under the radar, disguising radical philosophy salons as harmless poetry gatherings. Others helped serfs escape or gave them educations, treasonous acts under the Tsar's rule. These weren't loud revolutions, but quiet betrayals of a broken system. Japanese nobles had even subtler means of rebellion. A poorly timed poem, a gift with a hidden insult, refusing to shave one's head in mourning. All of these could be read as rejection of ritual. Some noble women resisted their arranged marriages by falling in love through poetry, subtle yet scandalous. Others withdrew into religious life, not out of piety, but protest. And then there were those who simply disappeared, nobles who faked illness to avoid court, who buried themselves in dusty libraries, pretending to be too engrossed in astronomy or botany to deal with courtly nonsense. Their retreat wasn't weakness, it was defiance. These rebels rarely made history books, but their choices, however quiet, chipped away at the illusion of perfect obedience. Not all nobles followed the rules. Some whispered no, and that, in their world, was louder than any scream. For all the grandeur and posturing, nobility was obsessed with one thing above all: legacy. Not the kind you feel, the kind you can engrave, paint, parade, and pass down. Portraits in oil, family crests etched into marble. Vast estates with names longer than some novels, every ball, battle, and betrothal was part of an unending project to be remembered. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Most of them weren't. Yes, we remember the monarchs. The kings who launched wars, the queens who lost their heads. But the average noble? Forgotten. Their elaborate rituals, their infighting, their expensive shoes, vanished like breath on glass. What remains are fragments, unsigned letters, crumbling estate walls, cryptic mentions in estate ledgers. The grand story of the aristocracy isn't one of eternal glory, it's one of selective survival. In France, the revolution didn't just end lives, it erased entire bloodlines from memory. Portraits were defaced, names were banned. The aristocracy who obsessed over how history would view them were instead swept away by it. Some survived, sure, by changing names, hiding jewels in fireplace bricks, or fleeing to foreign courts. But their legacies were not what they had intended. They became cautionary tales, not immortals. England's nobles fared better, legally protected, land-rich, institutionally embedded. Yet even they were not immune to irrelevance. Once buzzing estates now sit in ruin. Dust covers tapestries that once cost fortunes. The great names? Many dissolved through scandal, poor marriages, or just time. A line with no heirs is a legacy with no future. In Japan, the aristocracy was eventually replaced in importance by the military class, the samurai and shogunate. The elaborate poetry, the court rankings, the ceremonies faded. And though a few families trace their roots to ancient noble houses, the modern world rarely cares. Even the proudest names became museum labels. And what of those who tried to control the narrative? Commissioning epic biographies, dictating memoirs, sponsoring churches. They too are subject to history's selective memory. Often, the real stories, the shame, the secrets, the compromises, survive only in whispers, footnotes, or hidden letters. In the end, legacy was the ultimate illusion. Nobles lived in service of being remembered, yet were often forgotten entirely. Behind the portraits and palaces lies a quiet truth. Permanence was never real. Only the performance was. In the spring of 1900, a curious man in a wide-brimmed hat stood under the Cretan sun, staring at scattered stones and half-buried walls. His name was Sir Arthur Evans, a British archaeologist, historian, and eccentric dreamer. He had come to Crete not just to excavate ruins, but to chase a ghost. Specifically, the ghost of a civilization that had haunted Greek legends for centuries. A civilization so old it slipped through the cracks of both history and myth. For years, travelers and locals had spoken of strange artifacts surfacing in the hills south of Heraklion. Pottery older than Mycenaean, strange glyphs no one could read, and ruins that didn't quite match any known Greek style. Evans was convinced that these were the traces of a Bronze Age people, older than Homer, older than Athens, who had once ruled the Aegean. Then came the moment that changed everything. On a plot of land known as Kefala Hill, Evans and his workers unearthed a massive structure buried beneath centuries of dust and rubble. Walls emerged, not simple huts, but foundations of rooms, staircases, corridors. What they were looking at wasn't a temple or a fortress, but a palace. And not just any palace, one so complex it seemed designed to confuse anyone who walked inside. A labyrinth, perhaps. Evans immediately made the connection. This had to be the Palace of Knossos, legendary seat of King Minos. The same Minos who, according to myth, imprisoned the half-man, half-bull Minotaur deep within a maze beneath his home. Whether myth or not, the ruins matched the story. Countless twisting halls, multiple floors, mysterious dead ends. It was a palace that defied logic, as if built to trap not just people, but time itself. He called the people who built it the Minoans, after Minos. No one knew what they had called themselves. Their script, known as Linear A, was still undeciphered. But their art, their architecture, and their reach suggested an empire long forgotten. And so, with trowel in hand and a myth in mind, Evans began to peel back the centuries. What he found would challenge everything people thought they knew about early European civilization, and ignite new debates that still haven't settled. The Palace of Knossos is not a palace in the traditional sense. It's a puzzle made of corridors, courts, and chambers that seems to double back on itself with every turn. Covering more than 150,000 square feet, the structure was a multi-story marvel of the ancient world. And at its heart lay a paradox. How could something so open, so light-filled and advanced, feel so impossible to map? There were no grand walls or moats, no militaristic towers. Instead, Knossos had balconies, skylights, and air shafts. Architectural features unheard of in Bronze Age Europe. The entire complex seemed designed not for war, but for ceremony, administration, and perhaps mystery. Stairs wound in dizzying spirals. Narrow corridors opened into sudden courtyards, rooms connected unexpectedly. Scholars have debated for over a century whether this design was intentional, a symbolic nod to the myth of the labyrinth, or simply the result of centuries of rebuilding. To walk through Knossos is to surrender any sense of direction. There are rooms within rooms, wings that loop into each other, and passageways that lead nowhere at all. Evans was convinced this layout reflected the story of Daedalus, the legendary craftsman who constructed the labyrinth for King Minos to imprison the Minotaur. While there's no archaeological proof of a literal monster, the confusion felt while navigating the site is very real. And yet, the palace wasn't just a maze. It was a miracle of ancient engineering. The complex featured advanced plumbing, including terracotta pipes, flushing toilets, and a drainage system so efficient it would make parts of 19th century Europe blush. Rooms had natural ventilation. Light wells illuminated the inner chambers. Some staircases plunged down 3 or 4 stories, suggesting a deep, tiered structure rarely seen before the modern era. The throne room, modest by royal standards, lies tucked deep inside, almost hidden. Its centerpiece is a stone chair flanked by griffin frescoes, surrounded by benches. This wasn't a place of spectacle, but of controlled ritual. Perhaps here, power was less about dominance and more about illusion, mysticism, or religious awe. Knossos wasn't built to intimidate, it was built to mystify. Whether you were a trader, priestess, or foreign envoy, one truth was certain. Once you entered, the palace swallowed you whole, and made you forget the path you came from. Though the stone walls of Knossos are crumbling, its colours still speak. Buried beneath volcanic ash and time, the palace's frescoes emerged as some of the most vivid, enigmatic, and advanced artworks of the ancient world. Unlike the rigid, militaristic art of later Greek or Egyptian civilizations, the Minoan frescoes burst with movement, of dancers, dolphins, bulls, and goddesses. They didn't just decorate rooms, they told stories, hinted at rituals, and revealed a civilization that seemed to love life, beauty, and rhythm. One of the most iconic images from Knossos is the bull-leaping fresco, a young figure somersaulting over a massive bull in an elegant, impossible arc. Was this real? Was it myth? Historians have debated it for over a century. Was it a ritualistic sport, a religious offering, or simply a metaphor for taming chaos? Regardless of its meaning, the image captures something essential about Minoan life, a dance with danger, with grace at its core. Elsewhere, the walls bloom with lilies and crocuses, monkeys and birds, spirals and waves. In the Prince of the Lilies fresco, a slender youth with flowing hair and an ornate crown struts with ceremonial confidence. Though Evans initially identified him as a prince, modern scholars aren't sure. The figure may represent a priest, or even a goddess. Gender in Minoan art is fluid, symbolic, and still deeply mysterious. Unlike many ancient civilizations, the Minoans didn't focus their art on kings, wars, or conquests. There are no depictions of battles or slaves. Instead, there are scenes of celebration, of nature, of sacred rites. Women are central, not in the background, but front and center. Bare-breasted priestesses with elaborate skirts and coiled hairstyles perform rituals, suggesting that women may have held significant, even dominant, religious roles. And the colours. Deep reds, blues, and whites still cling to the plaster after thousands of years, defying time. The vibrancy of the artwork hints at a society that not only valued aesthetics, but understood their emotional power. These weren't just pretty paintings. They were symbols of cosmic order, human joy, and spiritual reverence. In the palace of Knossos, the walls didn't just see history, they sang it. In pigment and pattern, the Minoans painted a world of motion, mystery, and meaning. Among the many enigmas of Knossos, one stands out above all: the prominence of women. Unlike many contemporary societies where women were confined to the margins, the Minoans placed them at the center, literally and symbolically. Their images dominate frescoes, figurines, and ceremonial scenes, hinting at a civilization where female power wasn't hidden. It was celebrated. In the central court and sacred chambers of Knossos, depictions of bare-breasted women in flounced skirts and ornate headdresses appear again and again. These weren't submissive figures tucked behind kings. They were front and center, arms raised in blessing, holding serpents, surrounded by symbols of fertility, animals, and divine energy. Scholars believe many of these women were priestesses, intermediaries between the mortal and divine, responsible for overseeing rituals that touched every aspect of Minoan life. One of the most famous artifacts from the palace is the snake goddess figurine, a woman with a piercing gaze, holding serpents in both hands, with a feline perched on her head. Was she a deity? A high priestess? A representation of female sovereignty? We may never know, but her image tells us volumes about the spiritual hierarchy of Knossos, and who may have stood at its peak. In contrast to the pharaohs of Egypt or the kings of Mycenae, no clear Minoan male ruler has ever been identified in the art. No grand statue of a king, no battle scenes glorifying a warlord. It's led many scholars to suggest that Minoan society may have been matriarchal, or at least unusually egalitarian for its time. Women likely held power in both religion and possibly governance, guiding seasonal festivals, managing temples, and performing state rituals. Even the architecture reflects this balance. Rooms believed to be used by high-ranking women, with direct access to shrines, light wells, and private staircases, suggest they moved freely through the palace. Some frescoes depict women gathering in ceremonial processions, dressed in vivid garments, their posture commanding, not deferential. In Knossos, femininity wasn't confined, it was divine. Whether as priestesses, leaders, or symbols of renewal, women weren't secondary to Minoan culture. They were the culture, its voice, its vision, and possibly its soul. Knossos was not just a royal residence, it was a stage for the sacred. Every corridor, courtyard, and chamber seemed to pulse with spiritual intent. From underground crypts to sun-drenched altars, the palace was built not merely for living, but for communing with the divine. And while no Minoan holy book survives, the architecture itself whispers of rituals that shaped their world. The palace featured dozens of small shrines and ritual rooms, many of them tucked into secluded corners or carved deep below the ground. These weren't places for mass worship. They were intimate, mysterious, and likely restricted to the priestess elite. One chamber, often called the lustral basin, features a sunken tub-like structure at the base of a narrow staircase, not meant for bathing, but likely for purification rites. Perhaps initiates descended in silence, cleansed by symbolic waters before entering sacred ceremonies. The central court, vast and open to the sky, was likely the heart of public ritual. Here, hundreds might have gathered for seasonal festivals, celebrating fertility, renewal, or the turning of the year. The rhythmic sound of drums, the twirl of dancers, the chants of priestesses. Knossos was alive with ceremony. And always present in these rites was the bull, that powerful symbol of energy, virility, and the natural world. Throughout the palace, bull horns, stylized and massive, were placed atop walls and entrances. These horns of consecration, as Evans called them, marked sacred thresholds. Paired with the bull-leaping imagery found in frescoes, it's clear that this animal held deep religious meaning. Some believe a live bull may have even been part of certain rituals, not in brutal sacrifice, but as a partner in a spiritual performance, meant to mirror the eternal dance of chaos and order. The double axe, or labris, was another symbol often associated with sacred spaces in Knossos. Found carved into pillars and walls, it may have been a tool, a weapon, or a divine emblem. Its frequent pairing with female figures further supports the idea of a goddess-centered religion. No temples in the traditional sense exist at Knossos. Instead, the palace itself was the temple, every stairwell a procession, every chamber a chapel. It was a place where the spiritual and political were one, and where sacredness was woven into the very walls. Amid the frescoes, altars, and labyrinthine chambers of Knossos, archaeologists uncovered something even more puzzling: writing. Hundreds of clay tablets inscribed with symbols that no one, to this day, can fully understand. This was Linear A, the script of the Minoans, and one of the last great undeciphered writing systems of the ancient world. Discovered during Evans's excavations, Linear A looked superficially similar to another script found in Mycenaean Greece, known as Linear B. Evans assumed they were related, and they were. But while Linear B was later cracked and revealed to be an early form of Greek, Linear A stubbornly refused to give up its secrets. It's a language unrelated to Greek, and possibly unrelated to any known language on Earth. We can read its characters phonetically, but we don't know what they mean. Most Linear A tablets found at Knossos are administrative, inventories of grain, oil, livestock, or offerings. But without knowing the language, the context remains elusive. Were these taxes? Ritual offerings? Market records? No one can say with certainty. The Minoans wrote for over 500 years, and yet we still can't understand a single full sentence. This linguistic blackout gives Knossos its dreamlike quality. It's like listening to music through a wall. You can sense the rhythm, the energy, the intent, but the lyrics are forever muffled. We can see their rituals in art, their architecture in stone, but their thoughts remain sealed. Linear A was written with a stylus on soft clay, then baked by accident, preserved only because the palace was destroyed by fire. Without that disaster, their words might have dissolved long ago. Ironically, the burning of Knossos gifted us with the only surviving fragments of Minoan language. Some scholars believe Linear A might one day be deciphered, especially if bilingual texts are found, much like how the Rosetta Stone cracked Egyptian hieroglyphs. Until then, we're left with isolated symbols: a man, a bull, a jar, a sun. Meaningless, and yet hauntingly familiar. Knossos, for all its colour and complexity, speaks to us in silence. Its language sits just beyond reach, reminding us that some of history's greatest voices still wait to be heard, buried not in earth, but in mystery. The Palace of Knossos, once a beacon of art, architecture, and ritual, did not vanish in a single cataclysm. Its fall was not swift, but layered, the slow unravelling of a civilization whose power once seemed eternal. And like so many ancient collapses, the truth behind Knossos' downfall is a tapestry of fire, water, and whispers of war. Around 1450 BCE, something changed. Suddenly, across Crete, Minoan palaces and towns began to burn. Knossos, curiously, did not fall immediately. Instead, it was reoccupied. But the frescoes changed. The writing on the clay tablets shifted from Linear A to Linear B, not Minoan, but Mycenaean Greek. This suggests that the Mycenaeans, the rising power from the mainland, had either invaded or taken control peacefully after a catastrophe weakened the Minoans. Whatever the method, Knossos was no longer ruled by its native people. One theory points to the eruption of Thera, a volcanic explosion on the island of Santorini, just north of Crete, around 1600 BCE. This cataclysm was one of the most powerful in recorded history, devastating the region with earthquakes and tsunamis. The resulting chaos may have crippled the Minoan economy, wrecked their ports, and weakened their influence, leaving them vulnerable to invasion or internal collapse. Others argue for a gradual economic and political decline. As trade routes shifted and rivals grew stronger, the the centralized power of Knossos may have fractured. The palace, once buzzing with activity, became more administrative, more subdued. Ritual gave way to record-keeping. Art gave way to imitation. By 1375 BCE, the palace was abandoned entirely. Fires raged through its halls, roofs collapsed, walls cracked and buckled. Knossos was left in silence, its colours fading, its language unread, its rituals forgotten. And yet, it was never truly lost. Legends of the labyrinth and the Minotaur survived in Greek myth. Hints of Minoan influence echoed through Mycenaean palaces, and later, in classical art and architecture, the soul of Knossos lingered like smoke, invisible but present. Today, its ruins are open to the sun again. Tourists walk where priestesses once danced, and the palace that once held a civilization together now holds its secrets in plain sight, majestic, mysterious, and unfinished. When Sir Arthur Evans uncovered Knossos in 1900, he didn't just excavate it, he reimagined it. With a mix of scholarly ambition and artistic vision, Evans set out not only to preserve the ruins, but to bring them to life. He believed that simply exposing the foundations wasn't enough. The world needed to see the palace as he believed it once was, colourful, complex, and awe-inspiring. What followed was one of the most controversial restorations in archaeological history. Using concrete, a material completely alien to the Bronze Age, Evans rebuilt sections of the palace with modern methods. He employed artists to repaint frescoes using fragments found on site, but often filled in missing details based on assumption, not evidence. Balconies were reconstructed. Columns were restored not in dull stone, but painted red with black caps based on Evans's vision of Minoan aesthetics. Rooms were roofed, walls were replastered, and the ancient palace slowly became a hybrid, part ruin, part Edwardian fantasy. Some applauded his boldness. Without Evans, they argued, Knossos might have remained just another tangle of unremarkable ruins. His reconstructions made the site accessible, educational, and emotionally compelling. Visitors could walk through halls that felt alive, see murals bursting with colour, and visualize the world of the Minoans with more clarity than ever before. But others saw it differently. Critics accused Evans of overstepping, of imposing his own interpretation on a civilization we still barely understand. The frescoes, for instance, were sometimes almost entirely invented, based on small shards of original paint. Whole sections of the palace, such as the famous throne room, may have been assigned functions they never had. By shaping the ruins to match myth, Evans may have blurred the line between archaeology and storytelling. Today, Knossos is both a marvel and a monument to the complexities of historical reconstruction. Evans' vision cannot be separated from the site. His concrete structures still stand, his artistic interpretations still colour the walls. But visitors walk through Knossos with a dual awareness of what the Minoans might have built and what a passionate archaeologist believed they did. In trying to bring Knossos back to life, Evans may have given us two palaces, one ancient, buried in the earth, and one imagined, standing boldly above it. Today, the Palace of Knossos stands not only as a ruin, but as a bridge between myth and history, imagination and evidence, Europe and the ancient world. Long after its last ritual was performed and its halls fell silent, Knossos continues to fascinate, mystify, and provoke. Its very existence challenges our assumptions about early civilization and forces us to confront how little we still know. The palace helped redefine the timeline of European history. Before its discovery, most scholars believed that advanced civilization began with the Greeks. Knossos rewrote that narrative. Here was a culture flourishing 1,000 years earlier, with plumbing, urban planning, international trade, and symbolic art. The Minoans, centered at Knossos, were not primitive. They were sophisticated, expressive, and deeply spiritual. But Knossos' legacy is inseparable from its mythology. For millennia, the story of the Minotaur in the labyrinth was dismissed as fiction, a fable to frighten or entertain. And yet, When archaeologists unearthed a palace with hundreds of rooms, corridors that looped and twisted, and symbols of bulls carved into stone, the line between myth and history blurred. Perhaps the legend was not invented, but remembered, filtered through generations until only fragments survived. In modern times, Knossos has inspired not just scholars, but writers, artists and architects. Its double axes, horned symbols, and sinuous frescoes have appeared in fashion, sculpture, and even science fiction. The idea of a hidden, ancient civilization beneath the Mediterranean still fuels imaginations. A vision of a time when power didn't mean pyramids or conquest, but beauty, ritual, and balance. Yet Knossos also reminds us of fragility. The palace fell, its language was lost, its people vanished, and its meaning, its real, original purpose, is still debated. Every interpretation is a mirror, reflecting not just the past, but what we want to believe about it. Walk its halls today, and you stand where priestesses once prayed, dancers once twirled, and children once laughed. You stand at the heart of the oldest palace in Europe, a place that lived between sunlight and shadow, between architecture and myth. Knossos may never give up all its secrets, but in its silence it still speaks, of mystery, memory, and the deep, labyrinthine path of civilization itself. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus was born on December 15th, 37th CE, a child of privilege, but also of poison. His lineage was imperial, tangled in the Julio-Claudian dynasty that ruled Rome with both splendor and suspicion. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was the sister of Emperor Caligula, great-granddaughter of Augustus, and one of the most cunning political players of her time. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was known for arrogance and cruelty. It was said that when someone congratulated him on the birth of his son, he muttered, "Nothing could be born from me and Agrippina but something monstrous." Whether that was a prophecy or just bitterness, time would tell. At just 2 years old, Nero lost his father to dropsy, or possibly to poison. In a Rome where alliances were fatal and ambition was a blood sport, Agrippina now found herself a widow with a child and no real power. But she was patient. She watched as her brother Caligula spiraled into tyranny and was murdered by his own guards. She kept quiet as Claudius, the stammering, bookish uncle, was lifted to the purple robe. Then she made her move. By 49 CE, Agrippina seduced Emperor Claudius, her own uncle, and married him. She wasn't subtle about her goals. Within a year, she convinced him to adopt her son as heir, passing over his own biological son, Britannicus. Lucius became Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus, a name fit for emperors. She arranged his engagement to Claudius's daughter, Octavia, and hired Rome's finest tutors to mold him. Chief among them was the Stoic philosopher Seneca, who tried to shape the young man into a noble ruler. From the outside, Nero was being groomed for greatness, educated in rhetoric, poetry, philosophy, and music. He learned how to command a crowd, recite Homer, and manipulate public opinion. But Agrippina still held the reins. She appeared beside him in ceremonies, ordered his household, and made it clear who truly wielded power. Nero's rise wasn't born from destiny. It was engineered by a mother who saw herself as empress long before her son ever wore a crown. And within that gilded nursery of ambition and manipulation, the seeds of a chaotic reign were quietly planted. In 54 CE, at just 16 years old, Nero became emperor of Rome. Claudius, his adoptive father, had died, officially of illness, though many suspected poison. And the prime suspect? Agrippina. She had long grown impatient with waiting, and when Claudius began reconsidering his biological son Britannicus as heir, she acted. Mushrooms, legend said, were the delivery method. The food of the gods, some joked darkly, and perhaps the food of murder. With Claudius dead, Nero was rushed into power. The Roman Senate approved. The Praetorian Guard applauded, and Agrippina stood triumphantly behind him, dressed in gold and flanked by guards, the real architect of the regime. But she hadn't raised an emperor. She had built a puppet. In the early months of Nero's reign, Rome prospered. He gave generous bonuses to the soldiers, held public games, and promised a return to Augustan values. Behind the scenes, governance was handled by two key figures: Seneca, the philosopher-tutor turned speechwriter, and Burrus, the pragmatic head of the Praetorian Guard. Together, they steered Nero through complex decisions while maintaining a veneer of noble restraint. But Agrippina wasn't content to stay in the wings. She expected to rule beside her son, and when Nero began asserting his independence, tensions exploded. At first, the battles were subtle. She demanded to appear on coins beside Nero's image, something no Roman mother had ever done. She intruded on state meetings. She walked into the Senate chamber uninvited. She reminded Nero, constantly, who had made him emperor. The young emperor chafed under her control. He began to surround himself with his own advisors, men of pleasure and art, not of duty. He fell in love with Acte, a former slave girl, much to Agrippina's horror. She had plans for a royal marriage, not romance with a commoner. The once close bond between mother and son began to sour. Whispers spread through the palace, of shouting matches, slammed doors, veiled threats. Agrippina, once revered as the empress maker, now seemed a looming threat. Rome had given Nero a throne, but Agrippina still held the leash, and Nero was beginning to reach for the knife. His reign had begun with promise, poetry, and applause, but behind the curtain, a family tragedy was already brewing, one that would stain the imperial purple with blood. By 59 CE, the imperial palace had turned into a battlefield, not of armies, but of wills. Nero was emperor in name, but his mother, Agrippina, still loomed like a storm cloud over every decision. She undermined his authority, opposed his personal life, and plotted in the shadows to replace him with Britannicus, the late Claudius's biological son. Nero, once the obedient boy with a lyre, had become a young man desperate to escape her grasp. He acted first. Britannicus, a legitimate threat to Nero's throne, suddenly died during a banquet. Guests claimed he choked on his wine, but the poison was so fast-acting, his death was unmistakable. Nero denied involvement. Few believed him. Agrippina certainly didn't. With Britannicus gone, Nero's next problem was his mother. She had once ruled through him. Now he saw her as a rival. Agrippina wasn't just politically ambitious, she was relentless. She met with senators in secret. She paraded noblemen she hoped to position as replacements. She made veiled threats about the Praetorian Guard's loyalties. And worst of all, for Nero, the people still loved her. Rome admired strong women when they weren't too strong. Agrippina had crossed that line. Nero first tried exile. He stripped her of her bodyguards, removed her from public appearances, and sent her to live in a coastal villa. But distance didn't silence her. She still corresponded, still whispered, still pulled strings. So Nero made a darker choice. He invited Agrippina to a grand celebration, gifting her a lavish boat for her return voyage. But the vessel had been rigged to collapse mid-sea. When the sabotaged ship broke apart, Agrippina survived, swimming to shore under moonlight. The botched attempt enraged and humiliated Nero, so he tried again. This time, he sent assassins to her villa under the pretense of an urgent message. Accounts vary, but one story says she faced her killers calmly, telling them to strike her in the womb, the place that had given birth to Nero. Her murder sent shockwaves through the empire. Nero's guilt was immediate and consuming. He couldn't sleep. He paced at night. He saw her ghost in the halls. Rome, too, whispered of the unthinkable crime, the emperor who had killed his mother. With Agrippina's death, Nero had finally broken free. But in doing so, He also severed the last tether to restraint. What followed would be a reign untethered by shame and spiraling toward infamy. With Agrippina gone, Nero was finally emperor in full. No more whispers, no more maternal oversight, just unfiltered power. But instead of channeling that power into military conquest or administrative reform, Nero turned inward. He didn't want to be remembered as a ruler. He wanted to be adored as an artist. He fancied himself a poet, a singer, an actor. He performed publicly, something no Roman emperor had dared to do. To the Senate and aristocracy, it was mortifying. In Roman tradition, the stage was reserved for slaves and foreigners. But Nero was undeterred. He trained in music and drama, demanded applause, and filled amphitheatres with forcibly enthusiastic audiences. The emperor didn't just host games, he starred in them. Nero composed verses, sang tragic arias, and recited long epics of his own creation. He prided himself on his voice, even undergoing strange treatments to preserve it, including vomiting rituals, long periods of silence, and bizarre diets. Senators sat through hours-long performances, terrified to leave their seats. Not clapping could mean exile, or worse. He also threw resources into building theatres, sponsoring athletic contests, and redesigning Rome to reflect his aesthetic tastes. He introduced Greek-style games like the Neronia, a blend of Olympic sports and theatrical competitions, where, unsurprisingly, Nero always won first prize. His obsession with performance spilled into foreign policy. On a trip to Greece, Nero insisted on competing in every artistic contest. At the Olympic Games, he took part in a chariot race, with 10 horses instead of the standard 4. He fell off his chariot mid-race but was still declared the victor. Why? Because he would have won had he not fallen. A triumph in Nero's eyes. Yet even as he indulged in these creative fantasies, the empire groaned. Administrators were neglected, governors acted without oversight, the provinces grew restless. But Nero didn't care. He wasn't trying to be another Augustus or Tiberius. He wanted to be Orpheus, Apollo, or maybe something even greater, a god of music with absolute power. To the Roman elite, he was becoming a national embarrassment, but to the masses, given bread, games, and endless entertainment, Nero was a living spectacle, a flawed god on stage singing over the cracks in his collapsing empire. In July of 64 CE, a fire ignited near the Circus Maximus. Within hours, flames surged through the city like a divine curse. The streets of Rome, narrow, overcrowded, flammable, became a furnace. For 6 days and 7 nights, the capital of the empire burned. By the end, 10 of the city's 14 districts were reduced to rubble. Thousands were homeless. Temples, homes, marketplaces, gone. And where was the emperor? Rumors flew. Some claimed Nero had watched the blaze from a tower, strumming his lyre and singing of Troy's destruction. Others swore he had ordered the fire himself to make room for a new palace. Nero denied both, and in truth, he wasn't even in Rome when the fire began. But when he returned, he acted with theatrical flair, opening his private gardens to refugees, organizing emergency food deliveries, and funding reconstruction. Yet the whispers persisted. People needed a scapegoat, and Nero, ever the dramatist, gave them one. He blamed the Christians. They were already mistrusted, a strange sect of Jews who worshipped a crucified man and refused to honor the Roman gods. Nero accused them of arson and began a persecution so brutal it would echo through the centuries. Christians were torn apart by dogs, crucified, and, most horrifyingly, burned alive to serve as torches for Nero's garden parties. It wasn't justice, it was theatre by firelight. Meanwhile, Nero unveiled his true ambition, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. On the ashes of central Rome, he began constructing a pleasure palace of unimaginable extravagance, with artificial lakes, gilded walls, revolving dining rooms, and ceilings that sprinkled perfume. It was a monument to indulgence. A colossal statue of himself, the Colossus of Nero, was planned to tower over it all. To many Romans, this confirmed their suspicions. Nero hadn't just let the city burn. He had used the fire as a blank canvas. He had erased old Rome to paint a new one, starring himself. But Nero saw it differently. In his mind, he wasn't destroying, he was creating. He was remaking Rome in his image, dramatic, divine, and unforgettable. In trying to immortalize himself through art and architecture, Nero scorched the earth and lit the fuse of his own downfall. As Nero's reign dragged on, the applause began to fade, and the fear took its place. The emperor, who once danced across the stage, now paced palace corridors in a state of growing paranoia. He saw enemies in every shadow, conspiracies in every whisper. The artist emperor had become a tyrant in a mask of grease paint. Following the fire and the unpopular construction of his golden house, Nero's standing with the Senate deteriorated rapidly. The aristocracy, already offended by his performances and extravagance, now feared for their lives. In 65 CE, a plot was uncovered, the Pisonian conspiracy, in which dozens of senators, equestrians, and even soldiers were implicated in a scheme to overthrow him. Some wanted to restore the Republic, others simply wanted anyone but Nero. Nero's response was swift and ruthless. The poet Lucan, the philosopher Seneca, and the general Faenius Rufus were all ordered to commit suicide. Seneca, Nero's former tutor, and once his moral compass, was forced to slit his wrists while calmly discussing Stoic philosophy. Even those only rumoured to be sympathetic to the plot were swept up in the purges. The palace became a house of executions. The Senate chamber, a silent theatre of obedience. The emperor's paranoia deepened. He accused his own wife, Octavia, of infidelity, a charge so flimsy it insulted the intelligence of even his closest allies. She was exiled, then executed. Her head was sent to his mistress, Poppaea Sabina, as a twisted token of affection. But even Poppaea wasn't safe. During a rage, or possibly a drunken argument, Nero kicked her in the stomach while she was pregnant. She died soon after. Some say he wept for days. Others claim he mourned the loss of his muse, not the woman. Poison became a regular tool in his arsenal. He relied on the infamous poisoner Locusta, a woman whose concoctions had killed emperors and rivals alike. At Nero's command, she trained others, creating a small, macabre academy of assassination. By now, Nero's court resembled a stage soaked in blood. Every friend was a suspect. Every ally, a potential betrayer. And through it all, Nero continued to sing, perform, and believe that he was loved. But the audience was shrinking, the laughter was nervous, and the knives were getting closer. While Nero indulged in performances and purges in Rome, the empire beyond the capital began to rumble. The provinces, long the backbone of Rome's power, grew restless under the weight of neglect, extortion, and Nero's increasingly erratic rule. Taxes were high, governors were corrupt, and military prestige had eroded. In distant corners of the empire, patience wore thin, and rebellion stirred. The first crack came from the east. In 66 CE, the province of Judea erupted into full revolt. Tensions between Roman authorities and the Jewish population had simmered for years, fueled by religious oppression and heavy taxation. When Nero's appointed governors desecrated sacred temples and looted treasuries, open war broke out. The First Jewish-Roman War began, and it would cost Rome dearly. Nero dispatched one of his most competent generals, Vespasian, to crush the rebellion. Ironically, this act would later prove fatal to Nero's own reign. Meanwhile, in the west, the storm clouds gathered darker still. In Gaul and Spain, Roman legions began murmuring discontent. Nero's lavish lifestyle, the destruction of Rome, and his cruelty had eroded the loyalty of both aristocrats and soldiers. Governors like Gaius Julius Vindex in Gaul declared open rebellion in 68 CE, accusing Nero of being a disgrace to Rome. a self-absorbed performer unworthy of the purple. Vindex's rebellion failed militarily, but succeeded politically. It emboldened others. Servius Sulpicius Galba, the powerful governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, refused to recognize Nero's authority and declared himself a legate of the Senate and people of Rome. It was the first open call for regime change. Back in Rome, panic took hold. Nero's supporters began to flee or turn against him. The Senate, sensing the shift in power, grew bolder. The Praetorian Guard, once his fiercest protectors, was now bribed by Galba's agents. Their loyalty, like everything else in Nero's court, was transactional. Nero tried to rally support. He wept, begged, even considered fleeing to the eastern provinces and returning as a popular artist. But it was too late. The empire had turned against its self-declared god performer. Nero's isolation was complete. The provinces that had once cheered his rise now lit the fuse of his destruction. The emperor had lost his stage, and now the curtain was falling. By June of 68 CE, Nero was emperor in name only. The Senate had turned. The Praetorian Guard, once the iron wall around his throne, had declared allegiance to Galba. The people of Rome, once entertained by his games and theatrics, now watched in silence as the city held its breath. The empire that Nero had once tried to turn into a stage had now left him without an audience. When Nero awoke on June 9th, messengers brought news that sealed his fate. The Senate had declared him a public enemy. He was to be arrested and executed by the traditional Roman method, the poenaculae, or being beaten to death while naked, his head clamped in a forked stick. The same man who once performed to adoring crowds would now die humiliated and alone. Panicked, Nero fled Rome in disguise, dressed in rags and accompanied by a few loyal freedmen. They took refuge in the villa of his former secretary, located in the countryside outside the city. There, in a dark, overgrown garden, the last Julio-Claudian emperor hid in a ditch, listening for the sound of approaching horsemen. Even in his final hours, Nero's obsession with legacy did not fade. When he heard hoofbeats in the distance, he reportedly cried out, "What an artist dies in me!" It was not Rome he mourned, but himself, his talent, his image, his tragic ending. His companions urged him to die by his own hand, but he hesitated. For all his brutality, Nero was a coward when it came to death. Finally, as soldiers drew near, he pressed a dagger to his throat with the help of a freedman named Epaphroditos. The blade pierced flesh. He did not die immediately. As blood filled his lungs, he whispered, "Too late. This is fidelity." He was 30 years old. The soldiers found his dying body, astonished. The Senate, now under Galba, ordered his burial in a simple grave. No state funeral, no divine honours, just a quiet end to a chaotic reign. With Nero's death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the line of Augustus, Tiberius, and Claudius, was extinguished. What followed was a new storm, civil war, chaos, and the rapid rise and fall of emperors. But one thing was clear. Rome would never forget Nero. Nero's body was barely cold before legends began to bloom. Some Romans rejoiced, others mourned, and still more whispered that he wasn't really dead, that he had escaped to the east and would one day return. Over the next few decades, no fewer than 3 impostors claimed to be the resurrected Nero, appearing in Asia Minor with lyres in hand and songs on their lips. The myth of Nero, it seemed, had only just begun. For many in the Roman elite, his legacy was clear. Nero was a monster, a megalomaniac who murdered his own mother, burned his capital, and disgraced the empire with his narcissistic performances. The historians who chronicled his life, Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, painted him as a cautionary tale, the artist emperor who let vanity devour virtue, and yet not everyone agreed. Among the lower classes, Nero remained oddly beloved. He had reduced taxes, built public baths, and organized massive games and grain distributions. He gave Rome its greatest spectacles. Some even considered him a populist. Vulgar, yes, but generous. Centuries later, Christian texts would demonize him further, with early writers labeling Nero the first Antichrist and possibly the beast of Revelation. He was remembered not just as a bad ruler, but as a cosmic villain. Still, there was something magnetic about Nero's story. He was not the calculating tyrant that Tiberius or Caligula had been. He was theatrical, flamboyant, impulsive, often absurd. He ruled like a man in a permanent dream, casting himself as poet, god, and tragic hero all at once. Even his death felt like a scene from a lost Greek tragedy. In later centuries, artists, playwrights, and filmmakers would resurrect Nero as a symbol of fallen grandeur, a ruler too obsessed with beauty to bear the ugliness of power. His name became shorthand for excess and decline, a lesson in what happens when ego eclipses empire. But perhaps Nero's strangest legacy is this: he made power performative. He understood, centuries before mass media, that image could be as strong as policy, that if you controlled the narrative, you could shape the future's memory. And in that sense, he got what he wanted. 2,000 years later, we still remember Nero, not for ruling Rome, but for burning his name into history's stage.